The brutal reality of stagecoach travel that Hollywood never shows. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Independence, Missouri, as our story begins with a man who had already lived through more hardship than most could imagine. The lonely rancher stood at 47 years old, his weathered hands gripping a crumpled letter that had taken 3 months to reach him. News of his sister's family, missing somewhere in the Colorado Territory, had finally arrived through a network of traders and drifters. Hollywood would have you believe that stagecoach travel was an adventure filled with noble outlaws and scenic vistas. The truth was far more sinister, and the lonely rancher was about to discover just how brutal the reality could be. The Butterfield Overland stage sat before him like a wooden coffin on wheels. Paint peeled from its sides, and the leather seats inside were cracked and stained with substances he preferred not to identify. The driver, a grizzled man named Jeremiah Colt, spat tobacco juice into the dirt and eyed his passengers with the enthusiasm of an undertaker. "Climb aboard if you're fool enough," Colt growled. "We leave in 5 minutes with or without your prayers." The lonely rancher wasn't alone in his misery. 5 other passengers had paid the exorbitant fare of $45, nearly 3 months' wages for a working man. There was Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a widow traveling to claim her deceased husband's mining claim, her black dress already showing dust from the morning air. Beside her sat Dr. Marcus Finch, whose medical bag couldn't hide the tremor in his hands from what the rancher suspected was laudanum addiction. The most unsettling passenger was Thomas Grimm, a pale man with darting eyes who claimed to be a preacher but carried no Bible. His constant muttering and the way he clutched a leather satchel made everyone uncomfortable. Rounding out their group were the Morrison brothers, Jake and Samuel, 2 farmers heading west with dreams of gold and pockets full of borrowed money. As the stagecoach lurched into motion, the lonely rancher immediately understood why so many people chose to walk the dangerous trails instead. The interior was barely 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, forcing 6 adults into a space meant for cargo. The smell hit him first, a nauseating mixture of unwashed bodies, rotting leather, and something that reminded him of death. Mrs. Whitmore had already begun to look green around the gills, and they hadn't even left the town limits. The constant jolting over ruts and rocks made conversation impossible, and within an hour, Dr. Finch was openly sipping from a flask while muttering about the barbaric conditions of frontier travel. What Hollywood never showed was the immediate breakdown of human dignity. By noon, Mrs. Whitmore had vomited twice, once on Samuel Morrison's boots. The preacher, Thomas Grimm, had begun praying loudly in what sounded like Latin, but the words were wrong, twisted somehow, as if he were reciting something darker than scripture. The lonely rancher had traveled rough before, but nothing had prepared him for the claustrophobic horror of being trapped with 5 strangers in a rolling prison. The windows, if they could be called that, were just leather flaps that let in dust but provided no relief from the stifling heat. Every bump sent passengers crashing into each other, and personal space became a luxury none could afford. As the first day wore on, the water barrels strapped to the outside of the coach began to run low. Driver Colt had warned them that the next water stop was still 18 hours away, but what he hadn't mentioned was that the water they were drinking had been sitting in those barrels for weeks. It tasted of algae and something metallic that made the rancher's stomach churn. By evening, when they stopped at what Colt generously called a way station, the lonely rancher realized that his journey to find his sister's family might cost him his sanity or his life. The way station was nothing more than a ramshackle cabin surrounded by graves marked with crude wooden crosses. The proprietor, a toothless man named Ezekiel, served them beans that had more flies than protein and charged them $2 each for the privilege. As night fell and the passengers tried to find sleep in the coach, there were no beds at the station. The lonely rancher listened to the sounds around him. Mrs. Whitmore was weeping quietly. Dr. Finch was having withdrawal tremors, and somewhere in the darkness, Thomas Grimm was whispering what sounded like confessions of terrible sins. The Morrison brothers huddled together, already regretting their decision to head west, while outside, coyotes howled and something larger moved through the brush. This was only the first day of a journey that would take 2 weeks if they were lucky, longer if they encountered the dangers that Colt had only hinted at. The lonely rancher closed his eyes and tried to remember his sister's face, wondering if any family was worth this hell on wheels. Day 3 brought horrors that would haunt the lonely rancher for the rest of his life. The stagecoach had become a rolling tomb, and the passengers were slowly losing their humanity mile by agonizing mile. Mrs. Whitmore had developed what Dr. Finch diagnosed as dysentery, though his medical opinion was questionable given his constant state of intoxication. She could no longer control her bodily functions, and the smell inside the coach had become so overwhelming that even the hardened, lonely rancher found himself gagging. The leather seats were now stained with bodily fluids, and flies had begun to follow their coach like a funeral procession. The water situation had become critical. What little remained in the barrels was green with algae and tasted of death itself. Driver Colt had begun rationing it strictly, 1 cup per person per day, and that cup contained more sediment than water. The lonely rancher watched as his fellow passengers began to eye each other's rations with the desperation of starving animals. Thomas Grimm, the supposed preacher, had revealed his true nature on the second night. The lonely rancher had awakened to find Grimm rifling through Mrs. Whitmore's belongings while she lay unconscious from fever. When confronted, Grimm had pulled a knife and confessed that he was no preacher at all, but a confidence man fleeing from a murder charge in St. Louis. "God ain't watching out here," Grimm had hissed, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like a rabid animal's. "Out here, only the devil keeps score." The Morrison brothers had begun to crack under the pressure. Jake, the older of the two, had started talking to someone who wasn't there. His dead father, he claimed, who was giving him advice about surviving the journey. Samuel spent his time staring at his hands, which had developed a strange rash from the contaminated water, muttering about how they looked like they belonged to a corpse. Dr. Finch had run out of laudanum on day 2 and was now experiencing full withdrawal. His hands shook so violently he could barely hold his medical bag, and he'd begun hallucinating, claiming he could see Indians following their coach. The lonely rancher had looked back several times but saw nothing except the endless, hostile landscape. The way stations they encountered were worse than the first. At Dead Man's Creek Station, they found the proprietor had been dead for at least a week, his body bloated and crawling with maggots. Colt had simply stepped over the corpse, helped himself to what supplies remained, and announced they'd be sleeping outside with the dead man. "Better get used to it," Colt had said with a grim laugh. "Where we're headed, the dead outnumber the living 10 to 1. That night, the lonely rancher had discovered why. Mrs. Whitmore, delirious with fever, had told him about the letters she'd found in her dead husband's effects. The mining camps weren't just dangerous because of claim jumpers and accidents. They were being systematically murdered by organized gangs who would kill entire families for a few ounces of gold dust. "My Henry wrote that they found the Jameson family," she whispered, her voice barely audible over her labored breathing. "All 5 of them, including the baby, thrown down a mine shaft. Nobody even reported it to the authorities because there ain't no authorities out there." The 4th day brought their first encounter with what Colt euphemistically called road agents. 3 men on horseback had appeared on a ridge overlooking their route, but these weren't the romantic outlaws of dime novels. They were gaunt, desperate men with dead eyes and weapons that had clearly seen recent use. Colt had reached for his shotgun, but Thomas Grimm had surprised everyone by producing a rifle from his mysterious satchel. "I know those men," he'd said quietly. "They're part of the Bloody Bill Anderson gang. They don't take prisoners, and they don't leave witnesses." The standoff had lasted nearly an hour, with both sides waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, the outlaws had ridden away, but not before one of them had made a throat-cutting gesture that left no doubt about their intentions if they met again. That evening, at what remained of Skull Creek Station, burned out by Indians the previous month, the passengers had reached their breaking point. Jake Morrison had tried to drink his own urine, claiming his father's ghost had told him it would cure the rash on his hands. Dr. Finch had attempted to bleed Mrs. Whitmore with a rusty knife, insisting that her bad humors needed to be released. The lonely rancher had been forced to physically restrain both men, while Thomas Grimm sat in the corner, sharpening his knife and humming what sounded like a funeral dirge. Samuel Morrison had begun pulling out his own hair, strand by strand, arranging it in patterns on the coach floor that made no sense to anyone but him. As they prepared for another sleepless night in the coach, surrounded by the sounds of wild animals and the moans of his dying fellow passengers, the lonely rancher began to understand why so many people simply disappeared on these journeys. It wasn't just the outlaws or the Indians or the harsh environment. It was the slow dissolution of everything that made them human. Mrs. Whitmore grabbed his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so close to death. "Promise me something," she wheezed. "If I don't make it, don't let them bury me in this godforsaken place. Burn the coach if you have to, but don't let me rot in this wilderness like all the others." The lonely rancher nodded, though he wondered if any of them would live long enough to keep such promises. Outside, something howled in the darkness. Whether animal or human, he could no longer tell the difference. By the sixth day, death had become a passenger in the stagecoach, and the lonely rancher could feel its cold breath on his neck with every mile they traveled deeper into the wilderness. Mrs. Whitmore had died during the night, her body finally succumbing to the dysentery and dehydration that had been slowly killing her since the second day. The lonely rancher had awakened to find her cold hand still clutching his sleeve, her eyes staring sightlessly at the coach ceiling. The smell of death mixed with the already overwhelming stench inside the coach created an atmosphere so foul that even breathing became an act of will. Driver Colt had shown no emotion when informed of her death. "We can't spare the time or energy to bury her proper," he'd announced matter-of-factly. "We'll wrap her in a blanket and tie her to the roof. The buzzards will have to wait until we reach Bitter Spring Station." The casual callousness of this decision had finally broken Samuel Morrison completely. He'd begun screaming that they were all going to hell for desecrating the dead, and his brother Jake had been forced to knock him unconscious with a rock to stop the hysterical outburst. When Samuel came to, he was different, quieter, but with an unsettling smile that never left his face. Dr. Finch had volunteered to examine Mrs. Whitmore's body, claiming it was his medical duty. What the lonely rancher discovered later was that Finch had been searching her corpse for any remaining laudanum or alcohol. The depths of human degradation seemed to have no bottom in this rolling hell. Thomas Grimm had grown bolder since Mrs. Whitmore's death, openly claiming that God had chosen him to survive while the weak perished. He'd begun reading from a book that definitely wasn't the Bible. The pages were covered in strange symbols and what looked like dried blood. When questioned about it, Grimm had simply smiled and said, "Every man needs his scripture, rancher. This one served me well through 3 murders and 2 hangings." The water had run out completely on day 5, and they were now dependent on whatever they could find at the increasingly sparse and dangerous way stations. At Devil's Backbone Station, they'd found the well poisoned with what appeared to be human remains. The proprietor, a man named Silas Crow, had offered to sell them water from his private reserve for $20 a cup. The lonely rancher had paid the extortionate price, only to discover that Crow's private reserve was rainwater collected in barrels that had previously been used to store corpses. The taste was indescribable, but the alternative was death from thirst. As they'd prepared to leave, Crow had made an offer that chilled the rancher's blood. "You folks look like you're having a hard time of it," Crow had said with a gap-toothed grin. "I could make your journey a lot easier. Just leave me one of your passengers, alive, mind you, and I'll give you fresh water and safe passage to the next station." The fact that Colt had actually considered the offer for several long minutes told the lonely rancher everything he needed to know about how far they'd all fallen from civilization. The 7th day brought their second encounter with outlaws, but this time there was no standoff. The Bloody Bill Anderson gang had been tracking them, waiting for the perfect spot to attack. They struck at Widow's Canyon, a narrow pass where the stagecoach couldn't turn around or escape. What followed wasn't the romanticized gunfight of Hollywood westerns. It was a massacre. The outlaws didn't want to rob them. They wanted to kill them slowly for sport. The leader, a man with filed teeth and scars covering half his face, had explained their philosophy while his men prepared their instruments of torture. "See, we learned something from the Comanche," he'd said conversationally while sharpening a knife. "Killing a man quick is wasteful. You gotta savor it, make it last. We're gonna take you apart piece by piece, and the last one alive gets to watch what we do with the lady's corpse." It was Thomas Grimm who'd saved them, though his methods were as horrifying as the outlaw's intentions. The confidence man had somehow slipped his bonds and used his mysterious book to perform what could only be described as a ritual. The lonely rancher didn't believe in such things, but he couldn't explain what happened next. The outlaw leader had suddenly begun screaming about something crawling under his skin. His men had turned their guns on each other, claiming they could see demons wearing their faces. Within minutes, all 5 outlaws were dead by their own hands, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror. Grimm had calmly retrieved his book and climbed back into the coach as if nothing had happened. "Sometimes the devil protects his own," he'd said with that unsettling smile. "Question is, rancher, which one of us do you think he's protecting?" The 8th day brought them to Bitter Springs Station, which turned out to be aptly named. The springs were indeed bitter, contaminated with sulfur and something that made the water burn going down. But it was water, and they were past the point of being choosy. The station keeper, a woman named Black Mary, had taken one look at their group and burst into laughter. "Lord have mercy," she'd cackled. "You folks look like you crawled out of your own graves. How many you started with?" When told they'd lost Mrs. Whitmore, Black Mary had nodded knowingly. "She's the lucky one. Where you're headed, dying quick is a blessing. The Comanche have been real active lately, and they got new ways of keeping folks alive longer than nature intended." That night, as they prepared for the final leg of their journey, the lonely rancher realized that finding his sister's family was no longer his primary concern. His only goal now was surviving long enough to escape this nightmare and warn others about the true cost of westward travel. But as he looked at his remaining companions, Jake Morrison talking to his dead father, Samuel Morrison arranging human teeth he'd found at the station doctor, Finch trying to perform surgery on himself, and Thomas Grimm reading from his blasphemous book, the rancher wondered if any of them were still human enough to be saved. Outside, something howled in the darkness, and this time he was certain it wasn't an animal. The 10th day brought them to the end of the line, literally and figuratively. Bitter Creek Station was the last stop before the Colorado Territory, and what the lonely rancher found there would haunt him for the rest of his days. The station consisted of a single building that had been fortified like a military outpost, surrounded by a wall made of sharpened stakes. But it wasn't Indian attacks that had necessitated these defenses. It was something far worse. The stakes were topped with human skulls, some still bearing scraps of flesh, and the smell of death hung over the place like a fog. Driver Colt had grown increasingly nervous as they approached, and now the rancher understood why. This wasn't a way station at all. It was a slaughterhouse operated by a family of cannibals who preyed on desperate travelers. The proprietor, a massive man who introduced himself only as Pa, greeted them with the enthusiasm of a spider welcoming flies to its web. His wife, a skeletal woman with filed teeth, and their 3 adult sons completed the welcoming committee. All of them carried weapons, and all of them had the dead eyes of predators who had long since abandoned any pretense of humanity. "Welcome to Bitter Creek," Pa had announced with a grin that revealed teeth stained black with what the rancher hoped was tobacco. "We've been expecting you. Silas Crow sent word you was coming, and we got everything prepared for your comfort." The remaining passengers were in no condition to recognize the danger. Jake Morrison was now completely catatonic, staring at nothing while his lips moved in silent conversation with his dead father. Samuel Morrison had begun eating his own fingernails, claiming they tasted like communion wafers. Dr. Finch was performing imaginary surgeries on invisible patients, his hands moving with practiced precision through empty air. Only Thomas Grimm seemed alert, but his alertness was of the predatory kind. The lonely rancher had caught him eyeing the cannibal family with what looked like professional interest, as if he were evaluating potential business partners. The family's true nature became apparent when they were served dinner. The meat was fresh and had an unusual texture that made the rancher's stomach turn even before he identified what it was. When he refused to eat, Pa had laughed and pointed to a pile of personal effects in the corner, watches, jewelry, and clothing that had obviously belonged to previous travelers. "You're gonna eat, friend," Pa had said, his voice losing all pretense of hospitality. "Question is whether you eat it cooked or raw, and whether you're sitting at the table or lying on it." It was then that the lonely rancher discovered the true horror of frontier travel. This family had been operating for years with the full knowledge and cooperation of drivers like Colt. The stagecoach companies knew about places like Bitter Creek Station, but they continued to route passengers through them because it was cheaper than building legitimate way stations. The passengers weren't customers, they were livestock being delivered to slaughter. Colt had confirmed this when he'd pulled the rancher aside and made his offer. "Look, friend, I like you. You got sand, and you ain't gone completely loco like the others. So I'm gonna give you a choice. You can walk away from here tonight, take one of their horses, and ride back the way we came. All you got to do is keep your mouth shut about what you seen." The price for this mercy was simple. He had to abandon his fellow passengers to their fate. Jake and Samuel Morrison, Dr. Finch, and even Thomas Grimm would be butchered and served to the next group of travelers, while their personal effects would be added to the pile in the corner. "It's the way of things out here," Colt had explained with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. "Civilization's just a word we use back east. Out here, there's only survival and meat." The lonely rancher had spent the night wrestling with his conscience while listening to the sounds from the main building. Screams that were quickly muffled, the sound of saws working through bone, and laughter that belonged in hell itself. By morning, he'd made his decision. Using skills learned during his years as a rancher, he'd managed to start a fire in the station's supply shed. As the flames spread to the main building, he'd freed the horses and created enough chaos to escape with the surviving passengers. Jake Morrison had died in the fire, still talking to his father's ghost, but Samuel had followed the rancher with the blind obedience of a broken man. Dr. Finch had refused to leave, claiming he needed to perform one last surgery. The rancher had left him to his delusions and certain death. Thomas Grimm had simply vanished during the confusion, taking his mysterious book and leaving behind only a note that read, "The devil always collects his due." The ride back to civilization had taken 3 days, during which Samuel Morrison had died from exposure and exhaustion. The rancher had buried him beside the trail, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross and a prayer for forgiveness. When he finally reached Independence, Missouri, the lonely rancher was alone, half mad from thirst and exposure, and carrying a story that no one would believe. The Stagecoach Company had dismissed his account as the ravings of a man driven insane by the hardships of frontier travel. Colt had already returned with a story about Indian attacks and heroic last stands. The official record would show that the passengers had died in a Comanche raid, their bodies never recovered. The truth about Bitter Creek Station, about the cannibal family, about the systematic murder of travelers, would be buried along with the victims. But the lonely rancher knew the truth, and it had changed him forever. He never found his sister's family. Later reports suggested they had met the same fate as countless others who ventured into the territories. He never traveled by stagecoach again, and he spent the rest of his life warning others about the realities of westward expansion. Hollywood would eventually turn the American frontier into a romantic myth of noble outlaws and brave pioneers. But the rancher knew better. He knew that beyond the reach of law and civilization, humanity revealed its true nature, and that nature was far more brutal than any movie would ever dare to show. The West wasn't won by heroes. It was fed by the bones of the innocent, and watered with the blood of the desperate. And somewhere out there, in places with names like Bitter Creek and Devil's Backbone, the feeding continued. The lonely rancher lived to be 73 years old, but he never spoke of his journey again. Some truths he learned were too terrible for civilized ears. Some realities were too brutal for even the most hardened souls to bear. And some journeys, once begun, never truly end.